Hello, everybody, and a huge warm welcome to this evening's webinar. It is absolutely wonderful to have you here, and on behalf of everybody at the Howard League and everybody associated with this evening's event, a very warm welcome and thank you so very much for giving up time in your busy day to join us here this evening. I'm Neil Chakraborty. I'm a professor in criminology and director of the Centre for Hate Studies at the University of Leicester. I'm also chair of the Howard League's Research Advisory Group, and it's my very great pleasure to be chairing this evening's events, where we'll be exploring a selection of papers from this year's magnificent ECAN themed double issue, which was entitled 2020, A Year of Crisis or Kairos. The wonderful Harry Annison edited that double issue, and I'll be handing over to Harry very shortly so he can introduce that segment of this evening's event, and he can welcome our guest speakers, Marguerite Schinkel, Gwen Prowse, and Insa Koch. Those of you familiar with the double issue will know that its wide-ranging contributions raised a number of pertinent questions. They challenged assumptions and they presented a compelling case for us to rethink and to reset. In doing so, Harry and the contributors, I think, reminded us that with every crisis comes a window of opportunity that tests our capacity to change. All of us around this virtual table this evening, I guess, will have different ideas and different areas of expertise and interest, but all of us, I think, will be united in our desire for radical change. And that's something that the Howard League pushes for throughout all of its research activities, its legal work, and its campaigning work. So that's the first section of this evening's event. The second section gives us an opportunity to open up a dialogue about the Early Careers Academic Network. Anita and I are very keen to share some ideas about the ECAN network, but we're even keener to hear from you and to get your ideas on how we can make the ECAN work as best as possible and what you want from the network. So that's the kind of structure for this evening. Just a quick bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Harry. We're going to be recording this evening's event, as you're probably aware. There are people who can't make it tonight, so it will give them a chance to listen back. But we're not going to be recording the second segment where we're having an open, honest dialogue about ECAN. There's no need to be sharing that bit. So the webinar portion will be recorded. We're very keen to make this as interactive as we possibly can, so we'll be encouraging people to use the chat function and to pose whatever questions you want to pose within the Q&A, or to raise comment suggestions. However you want to interact, that would be wonderful. It is webinar format, so I think it's only panelists who are visible. I think everything else is audio only, so we certainly will be able to hear from you if we can't see you. Finally, I think we're all quite familiar with online events, so we're probably familiar with tech fails or Wi-Fi dying in the middle of an event. If that happens, just bear with us and we'll try and get it sorted as quickly as possible. But equally, if anybody needs to tune out for whatever reason, if you need to have a comfort break, grab a cup of tea, a glass of wine, deal with pesky children being pesky, which might well be the case for some of us, don't worry at all will be absolutely fine. Okay, does that sound okay? I'm posing that question. I can't actually see you, but I'm assuming there's nods behind your cameras. I'm going to hand over to Harry without any further ado. Harry.
Thank you very much, Neil. Hopefully everyone can hear me fine, and I think myself and the other parent panelists feel very seen. I also feel like I've made a mistake in not having a glass of wine to hand, but never mind. So it's a real pleasure to chair this event and to do so alongside Neil and also Anita from the Howard League. And it was an enormous pleasure to edit the themed issue, the double themed issue. Indeed, we had so many contributions that Neil mentioned. We are inevitably perhaps tight for time in terms of wanting to pack a lot in. So without further ado, let me hand over to our three excellent speakers. So I'll just very briefly say who they are, and then I can hand over to the first one. So we're really delighted to be joined by Marguerite Schinkel, who's a lecturer at the University of Glasgow, who will speak to the contribution to the themed issue, which was about experiences of lockdown in Scotland, or indeed in a sense a lockdown within a lockdown in Scotland for people experiencing criminal justice. And then Gwen Prowse, who's a joint PhD student in political science and African American studies, who provided a really fascinating contribution, written contribution with Professor Tracy Mears on conceptions of public safety, really, in the US, to oversimplify the detail that Gwen will talk about, I'm sure, in a really fascinating contribution. And finally, we're joined by Insa Koch, who's an associate professor at the law school at the LSE, to talk about, in one sense, or her contribution, which was an audio recording, a contribution which in one sense is about county lines, but more broadly might be understood as reflecting her work on class inequality and criminal justice, and really the need, I suppose, to have an ethnographic approach and an ethnographer's eye to thinking about the law and the way that criminal justice might actually work in and be experienced in practice. So without further ado, let me hand over to Marguerite first. And we have rather cruelly given our speakers only around 7 minutes each. So I'll give you a time check as we go through. Let me hand over to Marguerite. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Harry. Let me just share my screen. Is that working for people?
Yep, that's fine.
Yeah, excellent. So the first thing to say is that I feel a bit like an imposter because I didn't write a paper in the ECAN bulletin, but I was involved in the study. So really, the people you should think of when I'm talking to you is Ryan Casey, Betsy Barker, and Caitlin Gormley, who unfortunately all couldn't be here this evening. But so I will be talking about the implications of the study we did for current challenges in penal policy and reform. So to just put it in context really quickly for people who haven't read the paper, the Scotland in Lockdown paper didn't only focus on criminal justice experiences. So it was qualitative research, but on 4 groups already experiencing exclusion. And that was also women at risk of domestic violence, people with chronic health conditions and disabilities, and refugees. And the group that we looked at as a work stream was criminal justice. So what we did was, I will mostly be basing myself here on the prisoner survey and on the semi-structured interviews we did, but that excludes certain experiences. And I think that's important to know that we weren't able to put a survey out to people on remand. And we also talked to people in the community who were under community supervision. But in this talk, because I've got 7 minutes, I'm going to only focus on the prison experiences. So one thing that we found that was really quite disturbing, but it seems to be the case for pretty much everywhere, is the neglected punitiveness of prison in this case, but criminal justice experiences more broadly. Because what happened was that the experience of being in prison really changed from usually having quite a busy regime and people going out to work parties and having access to education and the gym, to being locked down 22 or more hours a day in cells. So we don't have that evidence from all the prisons in Scotland, but we do have it from many of the prisons in Scotland. And it seems there was some differences in practice. But if you compare that to the Mandela rules, where it's only 15 days or more of confinement of prisoners for 22 hours or more constitutes a form of torture. So this went on for months, right? So this started in March. We were doing our research in October, and there was just that kind of little bit of loosening of lockdowns, and people were having a little bit of more time out of their cells, but then it got tightened up again. So that means that the experience of prison has completely changed really, and is much more punitive, is much more difficult to survive, even though at the same time people were also saying that it's always difficult to survive. But the justice of that has not been considered. So in Scotland, community sentences have been reduced, except for certain offences like domestic violence and sex offences. But there's been no mitigation for those in prison. But even for those who were in the community, who have to do their community sentences, it's not so much about justice. If you read the justification why their sentences have been reduced, it's more about managing workload. And to some extent, all those sentences were suspended, so people will still be spending longer than they had expected when it comes to the date when they thought they would finish. And that's really not been given any attention, any of this, in policy debates or anything. The other thing that we really found was that there was a sense of institutional abandonment, especially in the prisons. Prisoners were given very little helpful information or any kind of certainty about what was going on from the prison service, often had to find out things from their family, who in turn didn't get their information from the prison service, but from the internet or from the news. They felt like they weren't protected from COVID. So bearing in mind that we spoke to them in October, they had just been given masks to wear within the prison. Staff were often not wearing masks. So their connections were also not maintained. All the visiting stopped, as I'm sure was the case in most places. But even when the virtual visits started, they were not managed in a way that made it easier for people to engage with them. Like either the visiting room was too noisy, people couldn't actually hear each other, the connection was too poor, but also family members had to be home at certain times that didn't suit them. There was just not a lot of consideration for the pressures that are already on people in these situations. So there was a lack of services generally, so most of the services weren't able to come into the prison anymore. And we talked to some very small third sector organizations that managed to pivot their service delivery completely from in the prison to the community. But that wasn't the case for larger providers and not the case for most services at all. So people were stuck in their cells for long periods of time, and you could argue that that was kind of beyond the control, that needed to happen to some extent to keep people safe, but also no new ways of coping were offered. So you can't go to the gym, you can't do any of the things that you usually do. But we had one letter where somebody described how a blind man who was in prison was provided with a coloring book for kids. So that just doesn't work on so many levels. But lots of people said, I've got no books, I've got nothing to do, I've got to do is watch TV. So there was no real kind of creativity or even thought about what are people supposed to do with all this time in isolation. And maybe even more seriously, that even in the most severe cases, and this is also in the paper, there was no mental or health care. So we do know of people who died from cancer with hardly any health care in the run up to that. But also there's a lot of prison surveys and interviews with people who had been released saying that they were really struggling with mental health, but there was no mental health provision. So there was nobody to see. People were told to just phone the Samaritans, and they couldn't always do that either. So they were really left to just cope. And we describe it in another paper that we're working on as an increase on pressure with no safety valves at all. So people just had to manage that pressure. And then finally, for the long-term prisoners, there was an abandonment of the process of rehabilitation during the pandemic. So all cognitive behavioral courses, all the kinds of things that they have to do to show that they're working on themselves had stopped, but the requirement hasn't been removed, right? So their sentences might stretch on much longer than they should do. And what we're really worried about is that we got some indications that staff were trying to see this in a different way. So we had one consultation response that said everything that was bad about the prison, like drug use and the way it has affected people's mental health, has been times by 100. There's been more on everything. It's the obvious result of a sudden routine change and being so confined for long periods of time. And there's been people losing their minds and suicides. Right, so that's really reflecting that increased pressure. But in staff interviews, and notably, we did only manage to speak to 2 Scottish prison staff, but they both were saying similar things. That they were saying it's the same for prisoners as well. Mixing with other prisoners can be the stressful time or the worrying time. They're not sure how others are going to be with them. So from that point of view, many of them some would actually say they've enjoyed the lockdown because of that. And I think that is a very serious, I think that it's a serious indictment of how they're looking at things, because really if people are worried about associating with people in prison, then you should work on that when they are associating with people in prison, rather than saying it's good that they were locked down for 22 hours a day. But as I don't know what has happened with that, but I was made aware at some point that the Prisoner Officer Association in England called for the COVID-19 restrictions to be made permanent in prison. So if we're going that direction, then that says a lot about what we're up against in terms of seeing the humanity and the actual experiences of people who are in prison. So finally, on the implications for penal reform, I think these findings and policy responses highlight the way that institutions and society kind of devalue prisoners as people. Like they're just not seen as people. And one quote that we had was, "We are the forgotten people of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's been no compassion shown to us human beings." And I think really there's been no compassion shown to them as human beings. Like it's almost like people aren't being considered. Like, can you put people in a prison cell for 22 hours a day for months and months and months? Probably not, but we have just done it and we haven't thought about it. And in terms of challenges, so there's really, in Scotland at least, a really persisting view of prisoners as the undeserving other. And Louise Brangans just had written a really interesting book called The Politics of Punishment, where she kind of trails that through time. There's a real lack of care about the injustice and punitiveness of prison. And I think we also should challenge the managerialism. That means sentences are shortened for workload purposes rather than for justice concerns, and in which staff can see the COVID regime as better because it's more easily manageable. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Marguerite. That's so fascinating. And I'm really impressed with your ability, or grateful for your ability to pack so much into a short period of time. So thank you for that. Well, let me hand directly over to Gwen, who, there you go, right on cue, is filing things up. I'll just tell you, yeah, that all seems fine. We can see that, Gwen. So Gwen, let me hand straight over to you, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for starting us off, Marguerite. Good evening. My co-author Tracy Mears cannot be here today, but today I'll be reflecting on how people most affected by community and police violence in the United States, where I work, describe their vision of public safety. In our ECAN essay, we argue that getting the right answers to public safety means asking the right questions. So rather than asking, for example, what is the best way to reform police in the United States or the UK, we ask, what is the best way to pursue public safety? Or more specifically, what's the best way to produce public safety for those who feel the brunt of violence in their neighborhoods and the state's typical response to that problem, which is often armed general purpose first responders. But getting the right answers also means asking the right people, as Marguerite alluded in her presentation. So rather than considering the question in a vacuum of elites and policymakers, we ask the stakeholders themselves. In the US, the most victimized by police and community violence are likely to live in poor communities that are Black, Latin American, or Indigenous. So how did we ask these stakeholders? I'm going to talk a little bit about that before turning to our findings. Between 2016 and 2018, we placed these gold shipping containers called portals in 5 different US cities and 11 different neighborhoods within those cities. All of those places experienced high levels of police-civilian contact. We worked with neighborhood curators like Louis Lee, featured here, to make this happen. This is in his neighborhood in Milwaukee. Inside of these portals was an immersive audiovisual technology where someone in one portal could speak to someone in another, as if sharing in the same room. So someone in Milwaukee could speak to someone in Los Angeles, for example. We call this the Portals Policing Project. Residents living in communities with high levels of police-civilian contact would speak with inside of these portals for about 20 minutes on the topic of policing after taking a brief survey. We collected about 850 conversations over this period of 2 years. So it's the largest known archive of conversations about policing by communities who experience high levels of police-civilian contact. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we learned. People living in and around Portals neighborhoods saw safety as an illusory concept. So safety included good housing, jobs, and resource schools. It was denied to mostly poor Black neighborhoods, but seemingly handed to white newcomers and at their places of work. A 30-year-old Black woman in Baltimore who also teaches puts it this way: there's no safety anywhere around here. They're just gentrifying our whole city. That's what's going on and then taking over. And police are just drug dealers and everyone in law enforcement sucks. That's pretty much the gist of law enforcement. Everything around us sucks and all the people are wonderful. The houses suck, the jobs suck, but there's money here, but our school system don't have any heat. We don't have any heaters in our schools, but they want to get a police force for Johns Hopkins, which is a hospital here. I don't understand how they can afford to do that. We don't even have heat in our schools, heat or air, both. We suffer all year. Notice here that the Baltimore woman describes police as a hindrance to safety and something that the city invests in order to bolster the safety and status of wealthy institutions such as a hospital. Further, in the Portals dialogues, we find that the police motto of protect and serve, which is on all police cars in the US, protect and serve read like a contradiction for Portals participants. So like the Baltimore woman before, others describe police officers almost as tax collectors or as a way to protect white wealth from local Black and Brown residents, not to protect community members from violence. So one says, are you all really here to serve and protect your people, or are you here to collect a dime for the city and government? Another participant says, they're not protecting and serving Black and Brown communities, they're protecting and serving property and white wealth. Being denied the promise of safety by state bureaucrats nominally charged with providing it did not mean that residents had given up on the idea of a state that could, however. They had clear visions of what it would look and feel like to engage with state agents who served them. Sociologist Monica Bell calls this police trust as aspiration, where Black American communities in particular seek to have public safety that works for them. For many Portals participants, a system that compassionately views their lives and their complexity is part of the alternative they imagine. So in this first conversation, someone says, if I was an officer and if I was called to a domestic violence situation, or I don't know, a robbery, me personally, I guess I would try to figure out what's going on, try to make it right, whatever. Other similar projects that ask residents about their vision and their experience of police, such as sociologist Michelle Phelps, comes across similar findings. In her research, we hear someone say, we all deserve to have policing in our communities or ways of managing things in our communities that are helpful and positive, rather than build down and destroy. So police trust as an aspiration, state trust as an aspiration. Calls for a more capacious vision of public safety is recursive throughout history. In 1967, following a swell of urban uprisings across the US, Lyndon B. Johnson, the president at the time, launched a field research effort to actually listen to stakeholders themselves about the cause of local rebellions. Here, many Black residents critiqued the police and called for the state to intervene, not through armed general purpose responders, but through a stronger social safety net. I'll give you a moment just to read this first quote to yourselves, and then consider the alternative to safety that a resident in Milwaukee is proposing in 1967. So despite being widely read and celebrated for its crucial insights about state violence and state neglect toward Black urban Americans, this 1967 report was largely ignored, eschewed instead for further investments in police officers and local surveillance. In other words, we didn't listen to the stakeholders even when we asked. So to conclude, by listening to stakeholders themselves, we find that public safety is a capaciously defined concept, one that transcends the penal system. It includes a sympathetic state and a robust welfare state that can prevent much harm before it is ever caused. A state and state agents that marginalized residents can trust to prevent harm rather than cause it. That's the heart of this vision. Further, in the last 2 years, the concept of police abolition has infused public discourse, and it became most prominent in the summer of 2020 after uprisings following the murder of George Floyd and the failure of the Donald Trump administration to protect its most vulnerable residents from the COVID-19 pandemic. Abolition has sparked controversy over its meanings. In our work, in our paper, we argue that these claims of abolition should be better understood not as a repudiation of the state, but as a call for a reconstituted state in these capaciously defined terms. So I'm over time, I'm just going to wrap up by saying, you know, the Portals Policing Project, what we're calling through this innovative technology and through this qualitative research is to look at the nuanced critiques of the state by residents, and then begin as policy, you know, as academics and policymakers to think about more capacious terms of public safety. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gwen, and as with Marguerite, thank you and well done for putting up with our and grappling with our unfair time restraints in some ways, but it's so great that we can pack so much in. And Insa can of course speak for herself, she will do now, but I wonder whether that idea of not a kind of blunt repudiation of the state, but actually a need for some more refined rethinking of it, or ideas about reconstituting it might be a bit of a connection between all three papers, and certainly onto what Insa might say. But Insa can more than speak for herself. So let me hand over to you, Insa, for our third talk. So thank you so much for this. If you're trying to speak, Insa, I think you're muted still, by the way. We can see your slides, but we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
And you can see my slides as well?
Yes, all ready to go.
Okay, right. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about research I've been doing on county lines and modern slavery. But before I get to that, let me just say a few words to tell you how I got to do this research project. So, so let me just change the slides. Yeah. So I'm an anthropologist, and I've been doing long-term ethnographic research on state-citizen relations in marginalized communities in Britain, trying to understand how citizens experience and interact with the state in its various sort of capacities in their day-to-day lives. And when I went back to my long-term field site, which is a marginalized council estate, about an hour's drive from London, I noticed what on the face of it seemed like a real shift. So in some of the families I've been working with and I've been living with at that point for several years, I noticed that the teenage children who were involved as kind of low-level drug dealers in the street-level illicit economy were no longer being criminalized by the state and prosecuted as, you know, I would have expected from the criminal justice agencies, but rather treated as victims, and even more so as slaves, as modern slaves who were in need of saving. And that really constituted to me a shift from sort of criminals to slaves, a real shift in language and policy approach, which to me at the time seemed like a big paradox. Now, it was a paradox to me, but there is actually a bigger institutional and legal context which has facilitated this shift in discourse and language. And this really just, if I can just very quickly whiz you through the context, takes us back to the Modern Slavery Act, which was enacted by the government back in 2015, and which provides a prosecution as well as a defense tool in cases of modern slavery, human trafficking, and servitude offenses. Now, what's important to understand is when this piece of legislation was enacted by Parliament, the kind of figure it very much had in mind was a sort of foreign trafficked victim, the immigrant who'd been trafficked between borders, across borders, between countries. And there's a big literature critiquing this idea of the kind of immigrant victim. But what interests me here is how this piece of legislation has become what I would call domesticated. So what the British government says today is that actually the largest growing group of slaves that it recognizes are no longer foreign-born nationals or immigrants who've been trafficked across national borders, but actually British citizens themselves. And this, the government attributes to what it has come to call county lines. Again, a new term that the police came up with roughly 5-6 years ago. And the term county lines refers to what the police experience or see as the expanding economy of illicit drugs, mostly Class A drugs, so heroin and crack cocaine, that are spreading from larger cities like London, Liverpool, Manchester, to smaller rural and market towns. And in that process, teenagers like the teenagers that I know from the families I've been living and working with are getting caught up in the drugs trade, usually as low-level runners. So they're the ones who transport the drugs between places and who sell them on the streets. And it's them who, according to the government, are now being treated and discovered as victims and slaves rather than as criminals who ought to be punished and criminalized. Now, I was really, like I said already, taken by this shift from criminals to slaves. And to understand what it really meant, I've been doing a multi-sited ethnographic fieldwork for the past 3 years. So working with frontline officials, the police, social workers, probation officers, people who at the front line implement these modern slavery policies. I've also spent months and months in the country's crown courts, basically watching the first ever modern slavery prosecutions that are being rolled out now against so-called county line human traffickers. And then most importantly, I've been working with the families whose children are now being discovered as slaves, or rather who fail to be discovered as slaves. And I just want to say that the kind of ethnography I do is applied, it's engaged. I act as an advocate for families in a lot of the cases using my own legal knowledge. And I'm very happy to talk about the kind of ethical implications of doing engaged research later. But now, in the interest of time, some of the findings. Okay, so what I'm essentially trying to do with this research as it's shaping up now is to try and complicate the sort of good news story that has very much been sold to us by the news, government, and also certain strands of academic research, which basically propagate this shift away from cultures of control from law and order towards a more compassionate approach in policing and policy. And what I found in my research is that there are at least 3 key areas where I think we need to ask some more critical questions. First of all, my research indicates that we ought to question the idea that the sort of narrative of redemption that's given to us in the news and policy is innocent or even neutral. I think what's happening today in public policy discourse is that county lines and the modern slavery stuff around it is being presented as a case of where individuals, typically working class, Black and minoritized communities, are being presented as being in need of saving from their own kind. And that is very reticent of older colonial logics of divide and control. Second, to the extent that modern slavery policies are actually applied, so safeguarding measures and care measures, that application has been extremely selective and partial. And in particular, the kind of working class and BME families I've been working with, I've come across so many cases where young people continue to be prosecuted for drugs and other serious offenses, even where they've been found by one arm of the government to be officially slaves. I've also come across other cases where many young people are not even entered into the government's modern slavery mechanism, so they never even are considered for safeguarding measures, and again continue to be prosecuted, tried, charged, and convicted, and experience very punitive prison experiences that we've already heard about. And finally, I think the picture really gets the darkest when we ask the question of, well, who then are the slave masters of today? Or in the language of the legislation, the human traffickers. And I just want to leave you with these pictures here I've taken from the news. I wasn't able to take pictures in court. There's only been a handful of prosecutions, successful prosecutions under the Modern Slavery Act in county line trials. But I think the pictures you can see here really speak for themselves, because what they show us is that essentially the kind of official slave masters of today in Britain are no longer the white master class nor the white British state, but actually, working class, Black, BME young people who often come from the very same communities that they're saying to exploit. Some of whom, I should also say, are literally the transcendents of Britain's transatlantic slaves. So where does that leave us in terms of policy? Just very quickly, because my time is up. I think if we want to have a genuine discussion about moving away from cultures of punitive control and criminalization, we ought to consider or start with at least 3 different agendas. One, I think, is to ask critical questions about what we actually mean when we talk about victimhood, exploitation, or slavery. And there's a real need, I think, to move away from kind of individualizing accounts that problematize these communities from within to an understanding of the structural issues that have led to many of the vulnerabilities in the first place, including 10 years of austerity politics and even longer decades of neoliberal destruction that has been raging in these communities. I think second, in terms of policy, we ought to really shift the debate away from narrow discussions around safeguarding and care towards the actual substantive racialized and racist injustices that continue to frame the criminal justice system. And that really means starting with the stories and the experiences of the families I've been working with and really putting them in context with experiences of so-called modern slavery and modern slavery policies. And finally, and I guess this is the biggest political and social challenge, I think really ought to question the language of slavery, you know, and the idea that this is something contemporary, modern, removed from the past, by making a conscious effort to bring history and its aftermath, its legacies back into the picture. And I just want to leave you with this. I think over the past two years or so, you know, social movements have drawn attention to an alternative understanding of history, slavery and its afterlives in Britain and beyond. And I think it's those kinds of voices and discussions that we really need to center against the backdrop of a government that has now reinvented and repurposed the language of slavery for very particular means. Okay, I'm going to stop. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Insa. That's fascinating. As was, and this all brings back the fascinating discussion we had, which was made up into the recording that's available as well. So thank you so much for that. So now we have some time for questions and discussion. I should just say that we're going to intentionally, if you like, have the event as a whole run till 6:10. I think it's a really, you know, no one wants events just running on without any clarity. So to fit in discussion and to make sure that Neil and Anita can talk about the exciting plans for ECAN, we're going to, if you like, intentionally make sure it runs on a little bit longer, but with that firm finish time in mind. So as I say, we do have a bit of time for questions and discussion now. As Helen said, I am told, I don't appear to have this ability, but I'm told we can enable people to ask questions on audio if they want to. I think the panelists can maybe see the questions in the chat potentially as well, but let me read them out in case everyone can't. So I think there's one initial question for Insa, and then I might have a more general question to ask all panelists. And so the question for you about really what's going on with these inconsistencies of prosecution that you talked about. So is this, for example, about police pressures or in internal police inclination, if you like, or the Crown Prosecution Service dynamics? Or I can see you've just responded to that in the chat, but I wonder if there's anything more you want to say about those dynamics that you've observed.
Well, I keep it very short. I do think you can't reduce it to a single factor. One of the key problems, however, I see in the problem is just that the various institutional, bureaucratic, legal, judicial levels, they just don't correspond to each other. You know, and this actually goes back to one of the comments somebody else made in the chat. Theoretically, the official fact-finding mechanism for modern slavery, the so-called NRM, doesn't actually have official judicial status, for example. So it doesn't mean that a young person who's found to be by one arm of the government to be a modern slave can't then also be prosecuted for offences. And that in itself creates a judicial nightmare where the status of these decisions is very much in dispute in courts. So this is just one example to show how the various institutional and governmental levels are just not in agreement with one another, and the sort of nightmare it produces for young people who are going through the system.
Thank you, Insa. And there's a question that I might use to pose to all three of you, really, because it connects with one thing I had in mind. Is there's a question from Caroline Bald, who asked, well, how can we change the narrative to one of what she calls discrimination by criminalisation policy? And that connects with my thought, or to put it a slightly different way, is I wanted to ask all three of you maybe of how sort of hopeful you feel, because as Insa pointed to, as I think Gwen pointed to as well, yeah, there are competing cultural dynamics, what we might call governmental dynamics. Gwen, just because we've just heard from Insa, I might hand over to you, Gwen, first, and then Marguerite or Insa might want to come in as well on that.
So, how hopeful do I feel? You know, I feel real tension around hope, because since the summer of 2020, white support in the United States, for example, of Black Lives Matter was at its highest, and now it's at its lowest in history of the protest slogan. And what this means in the United States, and I believe parallels the UK as well, is that support for the visions that protesters were calling for reframing of what a state can do for its citizens, and for the elimination of punitive practices by replacing those punitive practices with beneficent policies, has lost steam. And that's true in legislation in the United States that has essentially made it illegal for cities that support defunding carceral or punitive systems to actually ever reduce those budgets. So I feel very, very concerned about the ways that the ways that policy is being solidified to prevent any movement-based reform. At the same time, I feel hopeful, both being on this panel and also within the broader field of criminal justice and studies, is that there is a growing effort to pursue ethnographic participatory projects that demand that researchers become engaged scholars and become actively engaged in the process of not only learning, but actually advocating, and not from our position, but actually from the position of the stakeholders themselves. So that's my mixed response.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gwen. Marguerite, I don't know if there's anything you want to share from the Scottish context, really.
I think, like in Scotland, we're in a weird position that we have a government that says all the right things, and that somehow Scotland manages to paint a picture of itself as being progressive and welfarist, but that in reality, actually things are just as bad here and perhaps worse than anywhere else. Like, we have the highest imprisonment rate in Western Europe at the moment. Like crazy, and like 59% of people on remand in Scotland don't actually go on to serve a prison sentence. So we've got a huge over-reliance on remand. It's just a weird juxtaposition between the policy narrative and what actually happens on the ground. So I'm not that hopeful anymore about, like, in Scotland, you can be easily hopeful about the policy narrative, but actually in reality, that doesn't come to pass. So I think what we're doing at the moment is a few of us have set up a coalition against punishment, and we're going to try and get some information out there, but also connect all the more radical thoughts that is around in Scotland, but that hasn't really been unified. See if we can do something like to challenge at least what's going on. I'm not super hopeful. Like, people have been trying this for quite a long time now in quite a lot of different contexts, and so I'm not super hopeful that it will actually change things on the ground, but hopefully it will express some solidarity at least with people who are in these situations.
Thank you, Marguerite. Insa, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm happy to go to the next set of questions, or to the next part of the... Sure,
thank you. I mean, one thought I had, because we will move very briefly on to, or very shortly on to Neil and Anita and talking about the exciting ECAN plans. But I suppose one thought I had or two thoughts in that, which is one is sort of stating the obvious, because we've lived through it, is how those dramatic shifts can occur, and they can be for better or indeed for worse. Perhaps at best we're all sort of surfers waiting for the wave to come along. But in the context especially of maybe an early career network, then this will vary in different nations. And so I know the sort of English context best, but it struck me, and I've tried to take advantage of this at times, that I think there are opportunities for academics in relation to the kind of growing, what tends to be called the growing impact agenda in the UK, the growing knowledge exchange and public engagement agendas that can actually facilitate some of the good activities that Gwen was talking about and others have talked about, in terms of trying to, whether that's engaging with people affected by criminal justice, or in a sense empowering them or working with them to actually have their voices heard better. or simply recognizing what they actually experience and what they want to say, but also engaging with different levels of the state, if you like, is one way to put it, I suppose, and levels of the public as well. So there may be some opportunities there as well. Well, that's sorry, I was going to say let's move on, but there's one interesting question that's just popped up, which is a nice way to wrap things up. So there's a question from Alexandra Russell about how we can use this as the opportunity for any final thoughts. How can we generate steam within the public consciousness in the UK to care about prisons and prisoners and to support less punitive responses? And Alexandra saying there that the public attitudes tend to dictate policy and reform. There's a whole lecture we could have about the extent to which public does drive policy change. But I wonder if there are any final thoughts from any of our panelists about that question of actually generating or sustaining public consciousness around these issues.
Well, I think one of the opportunities is that there's a huge knowledge gap. So if I talk to people about my research that people spend 20 years in prison for repeated breach of the peace, almost everybody I meet in public thinks that's ridiculous. And I think there is an opportunity there, but it is a difficult thing because we always end up talking to the same people. I've recently worked on a modern studies resource in Scotland based on my research, so that at least you'll get some bums on seats that haven't chosen to be there. But I do think that is one of the biggest challenges is changing that kind of public narrative about bad people go to prison, which is kind of unquestioned by most.
Thank you, Marguerite. Insa or Gwen, are there any final thoughts you want to share broadly in relation to that question?
Well, I mean, it might just be a repeat of what Marguerite has already said, but I think we just need to democratize access to knowledge and make, as broad of a constituency as possible part of the kind of public discourse of what counts as justice and what we want. And that really, I mean, this goes back to what you said, Harry, as well. I think it really puts the burden on us as academics as well, who are technically, experts in our fields, to really step outside of academia and engage with our participants who do research with us, but also engage with the broader public, and particularly engage with people who don't like what we have to say. Yeah.
And maybe just a quick thing, this is actually reflecting more on Insa's presentation, but often we're inclined to try to shift the narrative about incarceration by talking about the innocence of incarcerated people, rather than recognizing that even those who have often committed violent crimes or participated in illicit economies are actually being harmed by the state themselves. So how we view children as enslaved or innocent, but once they are of age, then they become the people who are pictured in those mugshots. So what do we do to really complicate that narrative and implicate the state in the harm that creates harm at the community level?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gwen, and thank you to all our panelists for really fascinating presentations, for the discussion, and for grappling with our time constraints, as we've said. And speaking of time constraints, let me hand back to Neil and also Anita Dockley of the Howard League, who I know are going to speak about exciting plans and ideas in relation to the Howard League Early Career Academic Network.